The world remembers him as a symbol of tyranny, destruction, and unimaginable cruelty. Yet, before Adolf Hitler became the man who plunged humanity into its darkest chapter, he was simply a struggling dreamer, a failed artist in the streets of Vienna. Born in Austria in 1889, Hitler's early life gave no hint of the devastation he would one day unleash. He wanted to be a painter. He applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, but twice his application was rejected. Rejected by society, he wandered through cheap hostels, living off small pensions, and developing a growing hatred for the world around him. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Hitler found his purpose. He volunteered for the German army and served as a messenger on the Western Front. For 4 years, he faced the mud, blood, and death of the trenches. When Germany surrendered in 1918, Hitler, like many soldiers, could not accept defeat. He believed Germany had been betrayed, not beaten. The Treaty of Versailles humiliated Germany. The nation lost territory, was forced to pay enormous reparations, and saw its army reduced to a fraction of its former strength. For millions, hope vanished. Poverty, hunger, and unemployment tore the country apart. It was in this chaos that Adolf Hitler found his voice. In the early 1920s, Hitler joined the German Workers' Party, a small extremist group that soon renamed itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party. He was a gifted speaker, fueled by anger and desperation. His words electrified crowds. He promised to rebuild Germany, to restore its pride, and to find those responsible for its suffering. In 1923, he attempted a coup, the beer hall putsch in Munich. It failed miserably, and Hitler was imprisoned. But prison didn't silence him. Behind bars, he wrote Mein Kampf, his manifesto. It was a dangerous blend of nationalism, racism, and ambition. He envisioned a Germany reborn, powerful, pure, and dominant over Europe. When he was released, the world had changed. Germany's economy had briefly improved, and the Nazis lost support. But in 1929, the Great Depression struck. Millions lost their jobs. Fear returned, and Hitler seized the moment. He spoke to the desperate. He promised bread, work, and pride. His rallies grew larger. His image, the strong leader, the savior of the nation, became his greatest weapon. By 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Once inside the system, he dismantled it. In a matter of months, democracy collapsed. Opponents were arrested. Newspapers were silenced. The Nazis took control of schools, art, religion, and even thought itself. The Gestapo spread fear through the streets, and dissent vanished. Hitler was no longer just a politician. He was a dictator. Under his rule, Germany rearmed. Factories that once built cars now produced tanks and aircraft. Propaganda filled every corner of life. Children were taught to adore him, and millions followed blindly, believing in his dream of a 1,000-year Reich. But that dream had a dark foundation. Behind the speeches and flags, the Nazi regime began its persecution of Jews and others it considered undesirable. Laws were passed, stripping them of rights, jobs, and property. Hatred was turned into policy. By 1936, Hitler's ambitions grew bolder. He remilitarized the Rhineland, a direct violation of the Versailles Treaty. The world did nothing. Encouraged, he looked beyond Germany's borders. He annexed Austria in 1938, his homeland, and then demanded the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia. European leaders, desperate to avoid another war, gave in. They believed peace could be saved through negotiation. But Hitler had no intention of peace. In September 1939, he invaded Poland. Within days, Britain and France declared war. The world was once again at war, a war unlike any before. German forces, using a new tactic called blitzkrieg, or lightning war, struck with unmatched speed and precision. Within weeks, Poland was crushed. Hitler's armies turned west. Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands fell in quick succession. France, the proudest of European nations, surrendered in June 1940. By the summer of that year, all of continental Europe lay under Nazi control. Only Britain stood defiant. Hitler believed victory was inevitable. He had turned a broken nation into an empire of fear and power. But he wanted more, much more. He dreamed of conquering the East, of destroying communism, and of seizing the vast lands of the Soviet Union. In his mind, this would secure Germany's destiny. In reality, it would begin his downfall. The summer of 1940 marked the height of Adolf Hitler's power. Europe lay beneath his boots. From the shores of France to the mountains of Norway, nations had fallen like dominoes. The German war machine seemed unstoppable. Yet one island nation, Britain, refused to kneel. Hitler believed the British would surrender once they were isolated. He was wrong. In July 1940, he ordered an air assault unlike any the world had seen before. Thousands of German aircraft roared across the English Channel, determined to crush the Royal Air Force and bring Britain to its knees. But Britain stood firm. The Battle of Britain was fought not just in the skies, but in the hearts of its people. Sir Winston Churchill's words echoed through bomb shelters and battlefields alike. "We shall never surrender." Night after night, German bombers pounded London. Fires turned the city into a sea of smoke and rubble. Yet, through the terror, the British spirit endured. The Luftwaffe lost hundreds of planes. Hitler's dream of invasion, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, crumbled. This was his first defeat. He would not forget it. Frustrated, Hitler turned east. In his mind, Britain was merely an inconvenience. The true enemy was the Soviet Union. He despised communism and saw the East as a land of conquest, a space for his master race. In June 1941, he launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory, supported by thousands of tanks, planes, and artillery pieces. The invasion stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, over 2,000 miles of front line. In the early weeks, success came swiftly. Soviet defenses collapsed, cities burned, and prisoners of war filled endless columns along the roads. Hitler boasted that the Soviet Union would fall within months. He told his generals, "We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will collapse." But the door did not collapse. As German troops pushed deeper, they met resistance unlike anything they had faced before. The vast distances, the brutal weather, and the determination of the Soviet people turned the tide. Entire villages were destroyed, yet civilians fought alongside soldiers. By autumn, German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow. Victory seemed near. But the Russian winter arrived early, colder and harsher than anyone had imagined. Engines froze, guns jammed, soldiers dressed for summer froze to death in their trenches. Hitler refused to retreat. He ordered his men to stand their ground, no matter the cost. For the first time, cracks began to appear in the myth of German invincibility. Meanwhile, far from the Russian front, another storm was brewing, one that would pull the entire world into war. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan. Days later, Hitler, in a reckless show of loyalty to his Axis ally, declared war on the United States. Now, the conflict had become truly global. In that moment, Hitler had sealed his fate. He had turned the world's most powerful industrial nation into his enemy. As 1942 began, the war stretched across continents. German forces advanced deep into the Soviet Union, through the deserts of North Africa, and across the seas of the Atlantic. But beneath the victories, exhaustion and overconfidence began to erode the foundation of Hitler's empire. Inside his circle, few dared to challenge him. His generals warned that the Eastern campaign was unsustainable, that Germany could not fight both the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. But Hitler ignored them all. He believed in his own destiny, convinced that sheer willpower could overcome any obstacle. In his headquarters, hidden deep within forests and bunkers, he spent hours poring over maps, moving divisions like chess pieces. But the game he played was no longer winnable. The war had changed. The world had changed. Factories in America and Britain roared to life, producing tanks, planes, and weapons faster than Germany could destroy them. Soviet industry, relocated deep into the Ural Mountains, poured out artillery and aircraft. For the first time, Hitler's enemies were united and stronger than ever. Yet, he continued to dream of victory. His speeches grew darker, filled with fury and desperation. Millions still believed him, still followed him into battle. But behind the banners and slogans, the tide of history was turning. By late 1942, the German advance had reached its limit. In the Soviet city of Stalingrad, a battle began that would decide the future of the war. Hitler demanded the city be taken at any cost. The fighting was savage, street by street, house by house. For months, soldiers fought and died among the ruins. Winter returned, and the Soviet army surrounded the German Sixth Army, cutting off supplies. Hitler ordered them to fight to the last man. They did. By February 1943, the once proud German army surrendered. It was a turning point. The invincible Führer had led his forces into disaster. The illusion of endless victory was shattered. But instead of accepting defeat, Hitler grew more paranoid, more determined. He believed betrayal, not strategy, was the cause of his failures. He began to mistrust his generals, isolating himself inside his fortified headquarters. The world's most feared man was now trapped in a war he could no longer control. The winter of 1943 marked a shift in the rhythm of war. For the first time, Germany was no longer advancing. It was struggling to survive. The surrender at Stalingrad had shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. Over 300,000 German soldiers were dead or captured, and the news rippled across Europe like a shockwave. Hitler called it a temporary setback, but deep down, he knew the war had changed. Still, he refused to retreat. He ordered new offensives, demanded loyalty, and punished doubt. Anyone who questioned him was dismissed, demoted, or executed. His circle of trusted generals grew smaller, his isolation greater. In the West, the Allies were growing stronger. The United States, now fully engaged, poured endless supplies and men into the fight. Britain, scarred but unbroken, regained its strength. Across the seas, Allied bombers filled the skies over Germany, turning its cities into fields of fire. Factories, railroads, and homes burned night after night. The industrial heart of the Reich began to collapse. Yet, Hitler forbade any mention of defeat. His speeches to the nation promised new secret weapons and ultimate victory, promises built on illusion. Meanwhile, in North Africa, German and Italian forces under General Rommel were driven back by the Allies. The defeat at El Alamein signaled the end of Axis power on the continent. One by one, Hitler's dreams of empire began to crumble. But His greatest fear was the Eastern Front. The Red Army, fueled by vengeance, was pushing westward. Soviet tanks rolled through the snow, reclaiming land once lost. Each mile taken was paid for in blood, but the tide was unstoppable. By mid-1943, the Germans launched one last great offensive at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. Thousands of armored machines clashed across the plains. For days, engines roared, shells exploded, and men fought in blinding smoke. When the dust settled, it was clear. Germany had lost. After Kursk, the war entered a new phase, one of retreat. Back in Berlin, Hitler refused to accept reality. He surrounded himself with loyalists and demanded absolute obedience. His health began to fail. He trembled. His voice wavered. Yet his fury burned stronger than ever. He blamed everyone but himself, his generals, his allies, even the German people. He issued impossible orders, sending divisions that no longer existed into battles they could not win. Cities were declared fortresses, to be held to the last man. Whole armies were sacrificed to protect Hitler's pride. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Italy. Mussolini's regime collapsed almost overnight. The Italian people rose up, and their former leader was arrested. Hitler responded with fury. German troops stormed into Italy, freeing Mussolini and installing him as the puppet head of a broken government. But the damage was done. Germany now had to fight on yet another front. The war that had once seemed like a march toward domination had become a desperate struggle for survival. At home, ordinary Germans began to see the truth. The endless victories promised by propaganda were gone. Cities lay in ruins. Families starved. Sons never returned from the front. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich was turning into a nightmare that might not last another 1,000 days. By 1944, Hitler's paranoia had deepened into madness. He trusted no one. He believed his destiny was divine, that fate itself would not allow Germany to fall. In his underground headquarters, he issued orders disconnected from reality. His generals whispered of disaster, but few dared to speak openly. In July 1944, members of the German military made their move. They planted a bomb inside Hitler's meeting room, an attempt to end the war by ending his life. The explosion tore through the bunker, killing several officers. But Hitler survived, shielded by a heavy oak table. The failed assassination only strengthened his delusion. He called it a sign of providence, proof that he was chosen to lead Germany to victory. But the truth was clear. The regime was collapsing from within. Revenge followed swiftly. Thousands were arrested, tortured, and executed. Some were hanged with piano wire, their deaths filmed as warnings. Fear gripped the nation tighter than ever. Outside Germany, the Allies prepared for their greatest assault yet, the liberation of Western Europe. On June 6, 1944, D-Day began. Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, facing machine gun fire and brutal resistance. By nightfall, thousands were dead, but the beachhead was secured. Hitler had sworn that no enemy would ever set foot on continental Europe again. Yet, within weeks, Allied forces were pushing inland, liberating France, town by town. Paris was freed that August. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags, cheering soldiers. The world began to believe. The end was near. But in Berlin, Hitler refused to accept defeat. He insisted new wonder weapons would turn the tide, the V-1 flying bombs and the V-2 rockets. They struck London and Antwerp with terrifying speed, killing civilians without warning. But even these weapons could not change the course of war. As 1944 drew to a close, the Allies closed in from both east and west. Soviet armies were approaching Poland, The Americans and British crossed the Rhine. Germany was caught in a vice that was slowly, relentlessly tightening. Still, Hitler clung to his vision of final victory. In December 1944, he launched one last, desperate counterattack in the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. For a brief moment, German forces broke through Allied lines, and hope flickered once again. But it was short-lived. The Allies regrouped, the offensive collapsed, and the German army was shattered. By early 1945, the once mighty Third Reich was dying. Cities were ashes, armies were broken. The Führer who had promised glory now faced ruin. And as the enemy closed in from all sides, Adolf Hitler began to face a truth he could no longer escape. The beginning of 1945 was the beginning of the end. The war Hitler had unleashed 6 years earlier now consumed the empire he built. German cities lay in ruins. Rail lines were shattered, fuel was gone, and soldiers marched barefoot through snow. The mighty army that once conquered Europe was broken and starving. In the east, the Red Army surged toward Berlin, driven by rage and vengeance. Village by village, they tore through the remnants of the German defense. In the west, the British, Americans, and French crossed the Rhine. Germany, once the aggressor, was surrounded, trapped, and doomed. Inside his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler clung to illusions. He was 56 years old, but looked decades older. His body shook from illness. His face was pale and drawn. Yet he continued to issue orders to armies that no longer existed. Maps covered the walls, front lines drawn in pencil that had long since moved. Every morning, reports arrived from the front, each one worse than the last. Entire divisions lost, cities captured, allies gone. Yet Hitler refused to face reality. He spoke of phantom units, miracle weapons, and the inevitable collapse of his enemies. By March, the Allies were bombing Berlin day and night. The city that once represented the glory of the Third Reich was now a wasteland of smoke and rubble. Civilians dug shelters beneath the streets, while children were armed with rifles and told to defend the capital. Hitler's closest followers tried to reason with him. They begged him to flee south, to escape to the Alps, and continue resistance from there. He refused. He would not leave Berlin. He would not surrender. In April 1945, Soviet forces reached the outskirts of the city. The thunder of artillery shook the ground above Hitler's bunker. Each explosion drew closer, echoing like a drumbeat of fate. Inside, chaos reigned. Officers argued, generals wept, and secretaries tried to keep order as the world collapsed around them. Hitler raged at his commanders for betraying him. He dismissed reports of defeat as cowardice. Yet even he could hear the bombs outside. The war was at his doorstep. On April 20th, Hitler celebrated his last birthday. The occasion was grim. Few came to offer congratulations. The once grand leader sat slumped in a chair, trembling, staring blankly at the map in front of him. Outside, Soviet shells exploded across the city. Berlin was dying. In the days that followed, Hitler's mind unraveled further. He ordered imaginary counterattacks, scolded non-existent divisions, and spoke of alliances that no longer existed. Goebbels, his propaganda minister, remained by his side, feeding the illusion until the very end. By April 25th, Berlin was completely encircled. The Red Army advanced street by street, their soldiers fighting through rubble and flames. Hitler's once mighty empire had shrunk to a few blocks of ruined buildings. Inside the bunker, preparations for the inevitable began. Hitler summoned his remaining staff. His tone was calm now, eerily calm. He dictated his final political testament, blaming the Jews for the war and denouncing his generals for betrayal. There was no remorse, no reflection, only hatred and delusion. He married Eva Braun, his longtime companion, in a small ceremony inside the bunker. Witnesses said the mood was surreal, a wedding held beneath a dying world. Afterward, he shared a quiet meal, thanked his staff for their loyalty, and retreated to his private quarters. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life. Eva Braun followed him. Their bodies were carried outside, doused with fuel, and set ablaze, in an attempt to erase them from the world they had destroyed. Above ground, the Red Army stormed the Reich Chancellery. Soldiers raised the Soviet flag over the ruins of Berlin. The war in Europe was effectively over. Days later, on May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The guns fell silent. After 6 years, tens of millions of lives lost and entire nations destroyed, World War II in Europe had ended. The man who once promised a 1,000-year empire had lasted just 12. Across the continent, survivors emerged from the ashes. Prisoners were freed from concentration camps, revealing the full horror of Hitler's reign. The world saw what his ideology had created: the mass graves, the broken families, the faces of starvation. The myth of the great leader was gone. What remained was the truth, a record of destruction so vast that even history struggled to measure it. As news of Hitler's death spread, there was no celebration in Berlin, only exhaustion. The people he had ruled with fear now faced ruin, guilt, and hunger. Germany lay divided and defeated. Its cities turned to dust. In the following months, the world began the painful process of rebuilding. But the scars left by Hitler and his war would never fully heal. The guns of Europe fell silent in May 1945, but the echoes of war did not fade. Cities were gone. Families were scattered. An entire generation was marked by loss. From the ruins of Berlin to the ashes of Warsaw and the broken fields of Stalingrad, the world faced a single question: how could one man's vision lead to such destruction? In the weeks following Germany's surrender, Allied forces uncovered the true extent of Hitler's crimes. What they found was beyond imagination. Concentration camps, liberated one by one, revealed the horror that words could not describe. Mountains of shoes, piles of eyeglasses, and endless rows of emaciated survivors testified to the cruelty of a regime built on hatred. Millions of Jews, along with political prisoners, Romani people, and countless others, had been systematically murdered. The world stared into the darkness and realized this was not just war. This was genocide. In Nuremberg, Germany, the Allies established a tribunal to bring the architects of this evil to justice. Nuremberg trials became a symbol of moral reckoning. For the first time in history, leaders were held accountable not just for war, but for crimes against humanity. Inside the courtroom, the surviving figures of Hitler's regime sat behind glass. Men who had once commanded armies and dictated policy. Now, they faced evidence so overwhelming that silence filled the room. Film reels of death camps played before them. Witnesses spoke of torture, starvation, and extermination. The excuses of obedience and ignorance shattered under the weight of truth. When the verdicts were read, justice was served. Many were sentenced to death, others to long imprisonment. But the real punishment was the judgment of history itself, a record that would forever remember their crimes. As the trials continued, the world turned toward rebuilding. Germany lay in ruins, divided among the victors. The East fell under Soviet control. The West came under the protection of the United States, Britain, and France. The city of Berlin, once the heart of Hitler's empire, became a divided symbol of the New World Order. In the years that followed, a new conflict emerged, not fought with tanks and guns, but with ideology. The Cold War began, a silent struggle between capitalism and communism. Yet even amid this new tension, the memory of World War II lingered like a shadow. For the survivors, there was no easy healing. The trauma ran too deep. Entire families were gone. Cultures destroyed. Children who had grown up under Nazi propaganda now faced a world that demanded truth and reconciliation. For them, understanding what had happened became a lifelong burden. In the decades that followed, historians, filmmakers, and educators sought to ensure the past would never be forgotten. Documentaries, museums, and memorials rose from the ruins, each a reminder of what happens when hatred is left unchecked. Hitler's name became a warning, a symbol of absolute power's corruption, of blind obedience, and of how fragile freedom can be. His rise had shown how words could destroy nations. His fall proved that no tyranny lasts forever. The world that emerged from the ashes of 1945 was not perfect, but it was determined to change. The United Nations was created, aiming to prevent another global war. New laws were written to protect human rights. Science and technology advanced faster than ever before, driven by a desire to rebuild what had been lost. Yet even as progress came, the lessons of that era remained vital. Every generation that followed faced the same question: would humanity remember or repeat? Decades later, historians still study Hitler's life, not to glorify him, but to understand how a single man could manipulate a nation. He used fear as a weapon, pride as bait, and lies as truth. He turned anger into loyalty and unity into destruction. The tragedy of his reign was not just his evil, but how easily ordinary people followed him. That is the most painful truth of all, that evil is not born overnight. It grows slowly, nurtured by silence, by fear, and by the willingness to look away. Today, the ruins of the Third Reich stand as ghostly reminders. The bunkers, the camps, the memorials. They whisper stories to anyone willing to listen. Stories of victims and survivors, of courage and cruelty, of what happens when humanity forgets its conscience. For those who lived through it, World War II was more than history. It was a wound. For those who came after, it became a lesson written in blood. And at the center of it all stands one man whose dream of domination ended in a bunker beneath a ruined city. His empire collapsed, his armies destroyed, his ideology condemned. What remains is not his glory, but his failure. The failure of hatred to triumph over humanity. The war he began reshaped the planet. Borders were redrawn. Nations were reborn. The world entered a new age, one forged in sacrifice and vigilance. 80 years later, we still live in the shadow of that conflict. Every peace treaty, every human rights law, every warning about tyranny carries the echo of those years. The lessons of World War II remind us that freedom is fragile, truth is powerful, and silence can be deadly. Because in the end, history's greatest warning is not about Adolf Hitler himself, it is about the world that allowed him to rise.